Good. Welcome to week 2 of my webinar short series. These are a series of short, little easily digestible webinars that I'm doing that share basically some of the questions that I get most in my practice, and wanted to share some of these with you in case it will help you. And for today's portion, making the decision about whether to stay or go. And I actually divided this into 2 parts as I was preparing this, because I want to keep these, between 20 and 30 minutes. And so I just ended up with more content that we could do in 1 week. So we'll be doing part 2 next week. So for this week, we are going to be doing, for part 1, considerations, basically things to think about before you go. And just as a heads up, for next week, the part 2 will be covering what I call collecting the clues. And it will basically be some of the exercises and tools that I share with folks about how to make that decision. Because a lot of time you've got a lot of information coming at you from a lot of different sources. And there are a few key pieces of information from your own inner wisdom that are going to be key. And so I will be sharing some of the exercises and tools that I use with my clients, so they may help you. So basically, if you are in the stay or go zone, this is what I call this, you are likely sitting with the question, do I stay in my marriage or do I leave? And this can be a really uncomfortable place. It can feel pretty stuck. And what I experienced, in my life, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a moment, but what I see a lot is that there's this teeter-totter that you ride. And it can be, you've got a fun vacation, and so there's a little bit of a love deposit, but then you come home and there's a huge fight, and then there's a withdrawal from the love bank account, and it just goes up and down and up and down. And you've got some good things happening, some bad things happening, and this can go on for months and years and even decades in some cases. And what I will suggest to you is that being in maybe energy is not necessarily the healthiest place to be. It doesn't do many people many favors. And I am not suggesting, one of my biggest pieces of advice or things that I like to tell clients is that you don't want to leave too soon, but I also, if you've been in the maybe zone for years and years and years, I will suggest that that does not do you any favors. And so basically, this can, if you've got 1 foot in and 1 foot out, it can really lend itself to being stuck. And you think about anything in your life. If you think about a business venture that you were to take part in, a friendship, parenting, all of those things, if you had 1 foot in and 1 foot out, what would that do? And it just keeps you in a zone of extreme stress, discomfort, and nothing is getting your full energy. So you can't devote it toward healing. You can't devote it toward putting it toward a new life. It's really, you're just in this zone where the stuckness, the confusion that you may think you have is keeping you in this one place. And if you were on week 1, I talked a little bit about what we'll call the lie of confusion. Confusion can block you from your own wisdom. So in the stay or go zone, I often hear from clients, I'm very confused. And what that ends up doing is leaves you stuck and blocking your own wisdom. So my goal today and next week is to help you answer some of these questions so that you don't continue to ride that teeter-totter in the maybe zone of stay or go. So this is important to me, not only because of the work that I do with clients, but because of my own story. So I am a recovering attorney. I'm a practicing master life coach. I'm the author of the book, Unhitched. So you may see my little Unhitched behind me. I'm also the host of Sunny in Seattle Radio, a weekly radio show. And I think more relevant perhaps to our work here, more important than anything, is I am also a divorcee. And I went through a very high conflict marriage. We were 2 very strong-willed attorneys. We went through a surprisingly graceful divorce using the collaborative law model. And we ended up with a really beautiful post-divorce friendship. But the friendship didn't just happen out of thin air. We actually had several years, and I'll be talking more about this in the weeks to come, of really intense healing work. And we both showed up at the table to do that. But before that ever happened, I was in the marriage and considering whether to stay or go, when I'm really being honest about it, for years. I had red flags very early on, and I chose to overlook a lot of them. We did a lot of marital therapy, but a lot of my time with my ex-husband, especially toward the tail end, was in the stay or go zone. And I found that that drains your life force energy, keeps you from doing a lot of the other things in your life, including working on healing the marriage. And it's just not a great place to stay for years at a time. So I'm pretty passionate about helping people get unstuck, whether that means divorce or whether that means taking big steps to fix the problems. So let's go ahead and dive into our considerations now that you know a little bit more about me. So we're going to be spending about 20 minutes here today with this content. As I mentioned, this is part one, so we're going to be talking about considerations, things to think about before you stay or go. And then if you do decide to go, what to expect when that happens. And I also want to share with you at the end something to try before you do go. So next week, as I mentioned, we'll be doing collecting the clues, which will be some exercises and tools to help you in the decision making. I won't be taking any questions today because I want to keep these really short. If you do want to take it further, I'm going to share how to do that at the end. You can keep watching these webinars. I'll be doing them for the foreseeable future on these Wednesday mornings. But I also will share how to get in touch with me personally. And again, as I said, my thing is getting unhitched, not necessarily divorce, but just getting unstuck so that you can use your life force energy toward the things that are really meaningful to you, devoting them back into the marriage, devoting them to a new life, devoting them to the calling and the work that you came here to do, and whatever that looks like for you. So I just encourage you, no matter what ends up happening, that you make steps toward getting unstuck and getting out of the stay or go zone. So I want to start in part one, things to think about before you go. And I want to start with a quote. And the reason I'm sharing this quote is because one of the things that I hear most frequently, and this was something that was a big struggle for my ex-husband as well, when we were deciding whether or not to end our marriage. A lot of people fear that divorce and leaving a marriage would mean failure. And in the coming weeks, particularly next week, and I'll be doing at least one more webinar on this, about what to do with these thoughts and these fears of being a failure if you were to leave your marriage. But what I'll suggest is that there's another way to look at this. And I want to share a quote, and I'm going to share my screen here. Bear with me while I bring this up. So this is a quote. It's one of my favorite quotes from Glennon Doyle Melton. If you've read her work, she has a beautiful book called Love Warrior. So this quote, and for those, if you're just listening to the recording, I'll go ahead and read this for you. Successful love is not necessarily love that lasts forever. Successful love is any love that taught you, that changed you, that grew you. You did not waste your love ever. And I found this quote well after I ended my marriage, but I share it with a lot of my clients and the people that I work with because I think it's a very freeing quote. And I think if you can look at this not as failure, but as something that grew and changed you, one or both of you, I think getting out of the fear that it's a failure can leave you a lot more clear. It gives you a lot more freedom to make a decision that is right for you, whatever that looks like. So the next thing that I want to talk about here under considerations, things to think about before you go. Another thing that I hear a lot, and actually I had a divorce support group that I ran in Seattle for several years before moving here to Petaluma. One of the things that I would hear a lot in my office and in this group is that, oh, if I can just leave this marriage, all my problems will be solved. It's just he's the problem or she's the problem or the marriage is the issue, and we'll just end things and that'll be great. Everybody will be sunshine and roses, off to your new life. And that could be the case. I've seen situations where things are pretty amicable, and it's the best decision for everyone. But I would say that situation, even when it is the best decision, those situations are rare when it is just super easy and it's all sunshine and roses. What can end up happening for a lot of people is that you trade one set of problems for another. And a lot of people are not expecting this. So if you've are familiar in recovery with what they call the pink cloud, basically pink cloud in recovery is in the first few months of sobriety, there is this feeling often of joy, euphoria, and liberation. And what can happen, it's wonderful, but what can happen is after that wears off, some of the realities of the situation set in. And I noticed this a lot with the folks in my support group. There would be women who I'd see for a period of months, and they'd come in and they'd be, oh, I'm separated and everything is so wonderful, and I'm dating, and the kids are so much happier that we're not fighting, and good things were happening. And then they would hit a point when all of a sudden they were at the division of assets, or now they were having to implement the co-parenting plan, or they needed to sell the family house, things like that. And I say this not to scare you. I say this, I did my own set of trading one set of problems for another, and ultimately that was exactly what needed to happen for me. But I just want to make you aware that once you decide to go, it may be that the grass is greener. It was for me, but it just may take you a little bit longer to get to that grass and to be ready for that. Which leads me to consideration number 2 thing to think about before you go. There's something that I did after the marriage, but that I think works very well while you're still in it. And that is setting yourself up for a smooth transition by cleaning your side of the marital street. Another way to say this is to leave in love, not in hate. I even had a teacher along the way that she has coached and counseled couples that you need to love the other person before you go. And what I mean by all of that is basically just, this is an opportunity, and I'm speaking more from my own experience here than anything, although I've seen this a lot in my practice. But when you leave, when you are really, really angry and you are really feeling hateful towards your person, what can end up happening is that several months, several years down the road, that is still unresolved stuff, unresolved baggage. And if you can, while you're still in the marriage, even if you end up going, if you can, while you're still in the marriage, clean your side of the street, meaning take responsibility for the part that you played in helping create the unhappy or dysfunctional marriage. And again, I mentioned this in week 1. If you're married to a narcissist, a sociopath, a psychopath, anyone that falls in that cluster B personality disorder category, my coaching would be a little bit different. So I just want you to have some awareness around that, and I'll mention how to get in touch with me after if you have some questions about whether this is you. Again, I am not a therapist that works with cluster B personality disorders. I do coach women who are coming out of these kinds of relationships. But all that to say, that would be the caveat. But for the majority of people who are in a marriage with someone who is a healthy, constructive, for the most part, person, if you can take responsibility for the part that you played in creating the unhappy marriage, if you can try to fix or heal some of the things before you go, what I will suggest to you is that when you do leave, it is from a place of clarity and weightlessness. I don't know if weightlessness is fully possible, but you don't have the baggage. You're not carrying all this baggage with you of not only the marriage, but also the things that you're going to have to deal with about yourself. Because what I've also seen happen is that you come out of one relationship, and if this applies to you, then look at past patterns, but you end up inviting the same kind of relationship issues over and over and over again. And that may mean there's something to be resolved on your side of the street. And if you can do that before you leave, then the divorce and then the after effects of it may be a lot easier to deal with. And you may get to the greener grass a heck of a lot faster. I will just share that in my case, I was fueled by rage and anger and sadness and disconnection when I left my marriage. And while it wasn't the healthiest of marriages, about, 3 or 4 years down the road when I started doing some pretty deep personal work, the grief and the sadness hit me. Not that I had made the wrong choice, but that there was a lot that I hadn't dealt with, and that perhaps if I had dealt with it back then, that it would have made it easier going forward. And so Consideration number 2 would be looking at whether you've cleaned your side of the street. And this would also go back to what I talked about in week 1 around your inner scenery. This is part of the inner scenery work. If you can change your inner scenery, then that will help you make the decision so much more. If your inner scenery is clean, then you will know if you need to change your outer scenery. Basically, if you do your own personal work, take responsibility, clean up your stuff, then you will know, okay, I still need to leave the marriage. The marriage is still not working for me, even though I've done everything I can to get set up for success here. And so the other thing that I will also say, this is moving on more toward once you have decided to go or you think you're going to go, things you need to know before you go. So number 1, when people go through big life changes, when humans have big identity shifts, and going from married to single is one of those big identity shifts, you are going to be thrown into basically a bit of an ego breakdown or an identity breakdown. It's much like a caterpillar going into a chrysalis. It doesn't just go into the chrysalis and grow wings and then come out a beautiful butterfly. What happens in that chrysalis is it breaks down into goo. It is caterpillar goo that then becomes a wholly new organism, a butterfly. And you may experience the same things. So there may be a lot of, I don't know what is going on, and that's okay. There may be very big emotional highs and emotional lows. That is to be expected because you're reforming into a whole new person. Just because you were experiencing these huge emotional swings, grief to happiness, to sadness, to anger, to all of the things, it doesn't mean that you've made a mistake if you have decided to go. It means you're a human. Just be ready to experience some of these big shifts. And there is a roadmap. In my coaching tradition, we call it the 4 squares of change. Once you have gone through this metamorphosis, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm not going to get into the whole 4 squares here today because that's not in the stay or go zone. But if you have more questions, again, I'll tell you how to get in touch with me after. But basically just know that you're going to be kicked into square one, which is basically the caterpillar breaking down into goo before it can become a new organism. And that is okay. Again, it doesn't mean you've made a mistake. It just means you're human and there are going to be some bumps before you get to the new life that you will create. Okay, so the final thing that I will suggest to you in considerations, things to think about, this is something that was recommended to me by my therapist. It's something that I did with my ex-husband, and I'm so glad that we did. It's something that I recommend to my clients, and it's called a structured separation. So a lot of people think that if you get separated before divorce, that's just the exit ramp into divorce. And that is the case for many people, but it doesn't have to be. A structured separation is basically a conscious decision between the two of you to separate with rules, rules that you get to create based on what is unique to your situation and the values that you hold with your person. So things like, will we date other people? Will we wear our rings? Will we be in therapy during this time? Will we have any contact, just the two of us, like a weekly coffee date? What will happen? And so I did this with my ex-husband we started with 6 months or 3 months, and then we went to 6. We went to therapy once a week. We met for coffee once a week. We wore our rings and we didn't date. So those were the rules we set up for ourselves. What I will say that it did for me was it solidified what I already knew to be true. With the time and the space, I was able to see that the life that I wanted was on my own and not in the marriage. Now, on the flip side, I have a dear friend who did a structured separation for 9 months. When she first walked out the door for this separation, she really in the back of her mind was thinking, I don't have much hope that this is going to work. They had 3 kids together. There were a lot of reasons that they could stay together, but she just felt pretty strongly at the time that it wasn't going to work. As it turned out, after about 9 months, during which she was doing a lot of inner scenery work, she was cleaning her side of the street, whether or not that meant they would get back together. She was doing it for her sake, not for anyone else's. At the end of 9 months, she said she woke up and she realized, I want to be with this guy. I want to give it another shot. And she came back a different person because she'd had the time and the space to do the work that needed to be done to set her up, going back into this to heal what needed to be healed. There's a lot of scientific research out there to suggest that if you are in a high conflict, high trauma situation, or it doesn't even have to be high conflict, if it's just a lot of daily emotional stress around the relationship, that there's a lot of resentment, a lot of just undercurrent of emotional energy being spent, that you're in a different part of the brain. You're not in the rational part of your brain. You're in the limbic system that gets kicked into fight or flight a lot. And all that means basically is that you're not making decisions from your best place, from the highest wisdom that you have, from the rational mind that you have. You're getting jerked around perhaps by your most primitive part of your brain. So when you have a structured separation, it's like the pressure valve is released and all of that can dissipate a bit so that you are left able to make a decision again from a place of clarity and not getting jerked around by this emotional journey. So those are the things that I would recommend in our part one of this, things to consider before you stay or go. And so some of the pitfalls that I see here, this is the problem that I experienced myself and that I see for a lot of my clients is that it's really easy to stay in the stay or go zone, the maybe zone, for months, for years at a time. And you think, oh, I'll just wait until summer vacation is over. Or I'll just wait until the house is paid off. Or I'll just wait until the kids are out of diapers or off at college or whatever. But this is life, and there will always be something. There will always be something that comes up, whether it's a health diagnosis or an aging parent after you've sent your kids to college. Things are going to continue to come up. And so I don't recommend waiting until life is perfect. I would suggest that life is never going to be perfect. There may be times when it's better than others or maybe a little bit easier, but the whole point is don't let yourself stay in the should I stay or go zone for decades at a time, because remember, this is a discomfort and a stress all its own, different than just being unhappy in your marriage. And it can keep you stuck for a really long time. And it can drain life force energy that could be used toward other things like your calling, like healing the marriage, like creating a new life. Whatever the decision is that you end up making, none of that is served by staying in the maybe zone forever and ever and ever. So whatever that looks like for you to get unstuck, whether that means asking for help or finding a support group, whatever that looks like, I invite you to do it so that you don't do what I did and what some of my clients have done and spend a lot of time, because it's also not necessarily fair to the other person not to be honest about what you may already know to be true in your heart and in your spirit. So what I'm going to do now, if you want to take this further, again, I invite you to continue showing up at these weekly webinar shorts. If you want more specific attention, if you want to ask questions about your particular situation and find out more about how this stuff applies to you, I'm going to drop a link in the chat box. Let's see. And this is a link directly to my scheduler so that you can book a consultation with me to see how this applies to you. And if you have questions that you weren't able to ask today. If you are listening to the recording or not looking at this, the video version, you're doing audio only, I would just invite you to go to the website unhitchedbook.com. That's unhitchedbook.com. That's a website I have set up where you can download a free copy of my book, and you can actually apply a lot of what we're talking about today with the help of the book. Some people can do it on their own. Other people want more support, but that's a great starting place, is downloading the book. My contact information is also on there as well if you'd like to reach out. So I really appreciate you joining me today, and we will be back next week, same time, same place, for part 2 of the Should I Stay or Should I Go series that we'll be doing. Again, part 2 will be on collecting the clues. So tools and exercises to help you gather information based on your own inner wisdom to help you make this decision from a place that is from your highest wisdom. So thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next week. Bye.